Title: The Butcher's Debt. The billionaire Julian the Butcher. Vane, known for carving up companies and leaving nothing behind. The Muse, Sloane Ashford, the disgraced heiress of a fallen shipping empire. The Predator's Garden. The air in Julian Vane's penthouse didn't circulate. It loomed. It was chilled to a precise 64 degrees, smelling of floor wax, old money, and the metallic tang of the rain hitting the floor-to-ceiling glass. Sloane Ashford stood in the center of the foyer, her heels clicking against the black marble. She felt like an ant under a microscope. She had come to beg, a word that tasted like ash in her mouth, but Julian didn't do favors. He did acquisitions. "You're late, Sloane," a voice rasped from the shadows of the library. Julian stepped into the light. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than Sloane's college tuition. His dark hair pushed back, eyes the color of a winter sea. He had been watching her for 10 years. He had loved her since she was 18, a secret wrought in his heart that had turned his soul black, but Sloane only knew him as the man who had systematically destroyed her father's business. "The traffic was difficult," Sloane snapped, her chin tilting up. "Or did you buy the streets today, too?" Julian leaned against the doorframe, a predatory smirk tugging at his lips. "I thought about it, but I'd rather own the woman walking on them. In your dreams, Julian." "Sloane, darling," he walked toward her, his presence closing in like a physical weight. He stopped so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "I stopped dreaming years ago. I started doing, you're here because you're bankrupt. You're here because I own your mortgage, your car, and the very air in your lungs. You're the one living in a dream if you think you're leaving here tonight." He reached out, his thumb grazing her lower lip. It was a soft gesture, but his eyes were hungry, desperate, and terrifyingly dark. "I fell for you when you were a girl in a white sundress, Sloane. Now, I want to see you in black, mourning the life you thought you had, so you can start the one I've built for you." The move into Julian's estate, the Obsidian, hadn't felt like a relocation. It felt like an arrest. The bedroom he had assigned Sloane was larger than her entire former apartment. It was a cathedral of ivory silk and cold gray stone, but as she pushed open the heavy oak doors, the air in the room felt different. It was heavy with the scent of crushed peonies and expensive paper. There, sitting in the center of the sprawling king-sized bed, was a single lacquered black box. No ribbon, no card, just a silent waiting weight. Sloane's heart hammered against her ribs. Julian didn't do nice. Every gesture was a hook hidden in bait. She approached the bed, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in midnight blue velvet, was a necklace. It wasn't diamonds or gold. It was a vintage, hand-carved locket made of blackened silver, shaped like a pomegranate. Sloane let out a shaky breath, her knees nearly giving out. She knew this piece. She had seen it exactly once 12 years ago, at a dusty estate auction in Paris when she was just a girl traveling with her father. She had begged for it, but the bidding had gone too high. An anonymous buyer had snatched it away for a price that was frankly insulting for a piece of silver. She had spent a decade wondering where it went. Now it was here. "Do you like it?" The voice came from the dark corner of the room. Julian was sitting in a velvet armchair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He hadn't turned on the lights. He'd just been sitting there, in the shadows, watching her discover his secret. "You," Sloane whispered, clutching the locket so hard the silver bit into her palm. "You were the anonymous buyer in Paris. I was 16, Julian. You've been holding on to this for 12 years. Julian stood, his tall frame cutting a terrifying silhouette against the moonlight. He walked toward her with the slow, deliberate grace of a wolf who knows the sheep has nowhere to run. "I've been holding on to a lot of things for you." "Sloane," he purred, stopping just inches from her. The heat of him was a contrast to the cold silver in her hand. "I bought that locket because you cried when you lost the bid. I hated seeing you cry for something I could easily own." "This is sick," she breathed, though she didn't move away. "You've been tracking me since I was a child." Julian reached out, his fingers brushing the hair away from her neck. His touch was electric, a searing brand on her skin. "I wasn't tracking you, Sloane. I was waiting for you. There's a difference." He took the locket from her hand, his fingers lingering on hers. He stepped behind her, the metal cold against her skin as he draped the chain around her neck. His breath hitched against her ear, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly low. "I fell in love with a girl who wanted the world," he whispered, his hand sliding down to rest on her waist. pulling her back against his hard chest. So I decided to buy the world and wait for her to come realize. I was the only one holding the deed. Sloane turned in his arms, her eyes flashing with a mix of fury and a dark, traitorous heat. You think a piece of silver makes up for what you did to my father's company? You're a monster, Julian. Julian grinned, a sharp, beautiful flash of teeth. He leaned down, his lips a hair's breadth from hers. I never claimed to be a prince, Sloane. And you're no damsel. You love the weight of this chain around your neck. You love knowing that I've spent 12 years obsessed with the way you breathe. He stepped back, leaving her cold and reeling. Wear it to dinner. If you don't, I might have to find another way to remind you who you belong to. The dining room of the Obsidian was a cavern of glass and steel, suspended over the city lights like a predator's perch. The table was a 20-foot slab of petrified wood, polished to a mirror shine. But Julian had set only 2 places, at opposite ends, a tactical distance that felt like a challenge. Sloane entered the room with a deliberate, slow-burn grace. She had changed into a silk dress the color of spilled wine, the neckline plunging just enough to highlight the blackened silver pomegranate resting against her collarbone. Julian was already seated, swirling a deep red vintage in a crystal glass. His eyes didn't just look at her. They mapped her. When they landed on the locket, his pupils flared, a physical reaction he couldn't mask. You look obedient, Julian remarked, his voice like gravel over velvet. It's a look that suits you, Sloane. Rare, but lovely. Sloane didn't take her seat. Instead, she walked the length of the table, her hips swaying with a lethal confidence. She stopped right beside his chair, leaning down until her face was inches from his. The scent of her perfume, jasmine and something sharp, like a thunderstorm, filled his lungs. Obedient? She echoed, a playful, cruel smile tugging at her lips. She reached up and toyed with the pomegranate locket, clicking the tiny latch open and shut, snap, snap, snap. I thought you were more observant than that, Julian. I'm not wearing this because you told me to. Julian's hand tightened around the stem of his wine glass. No? No. She leaned closer, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. I'm wearing it because I wanted to see if the rumors were true. They say the great butcher. Vane is a man of iron, but I see the way. Your pulse jumps in your neck when I touch this. I see the way you look at a piece of silver you bought 12 years ago for a girl who didn't even know your name. She ran a finger down the lapel of his suit, trailing it dangerously close to his heart. You didn't just buy a trinket, Julian. You bought a tether. But the thing about tethers is, they work both ways. Every minute you spent thinking about me in Paris, every dollar you spent destroying my father just to get me in this room. That wasn't power. She leaned in, her lips almost brushing his ear. That was a confession. You've been my slave for a decade, and you're just now realizing I've finally noticed the leash. The silence in the room became heavy, pressurized. Julian set his glass down with a controlled click. He stood up slowly, towering over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. He didn't look angry. He looked starved. You think you found a crack in the armor, little bird. He stepped into her space, forcing her back against the table. He gripped the edge of the wood on either side of her, pinning her in. You think my obsession makes me weak? I think it makes you predictable, she teased, her eyes defiant even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She reached up, grabbing his tie and pulling him down until their foreheads touched. Tell me, Julian, when you were alone in your cold offices, building your empire, did you imagine me saying thank you? Or did you imagine me hating you so much that it felt like love? Julian's composure fractured. He grabbed her waist, his fingers digging into the silk of her dress with a possessive bruising force. I imagined you exactly like this, he growled, his voice dropping to a dark primal register, heated, sharp, trying to use my own heart as a knife against me. But remember this, Sloane. I've had 12 years to learn how to bleed for you. You've only had one night to learn how to survive me. He leaned down, his mouth hovering over hers, the teasing suddenly replaced by a raw, jagged hunger. Dinner is getting cold. But then again, I've always preferred the taste of something that bites back. Sloane has successfully provoked the beast, but Julian is far from defeated. The adrenaline from their confrontation at dinner was still humming in Sloane's veins. Julian had retreated to his study for a global conference call, but his parting glance had been a silent dare. She didn't go to her room. Instead, she slipped through the darkened hallways of the Obsidian, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. She was looking for the one door that didn't fit, the one Julian's eyes drifted toward every time. He thought she wasn't looking. Deep in the north wing, behind a heavy tapestry of a fallen king, she found it. A keypad and a biometric scanner. But Julian was arrogant. He thought his power was his security. Sloane remembered the snap of the pomegranate locket, the date carved inside in microscopic font. 6/12/14. The day of the auction in Paris. She punched the numbers in. The light turned green with a mechanical thrum. The archive of a ghost. The room wasn't a vault of gold or documents. It was a sensory overload of her. The air was climate-controlled, smelling faintly of old paper and the specific, expensive vanilla perfume she had worn 3 years ago, a scent that had been discontinued. On the shelves sat dozens of bottles of it, hoarded like liquid gold. Sloane's breath hitched. This wasn't just a room. It was a museum where she was the only exhibit. The walls. They weren't covered in photos of her in public. They were covered in candid, grainy shots taken from a distance. Sloane laughing at a cafe in London. Sloane crying at her mother's funeral. Sloane walking alone in the rain. The pedestals. Under glass domes lay mundane objects she had lost over the years. A silk scarf she thought she'd left on a train. A fountain pen from her university days. Even a dried flower from a bouquet she had once thrown in the trash. The centerpiece. A massive leather-bound ledger sat on a velvet plinth. Sloane opened the ledger. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger of every person who had ever wronged her. Next to her father's business rivals, there were red lines drawn through names. Next to an ex-boyfriend who had cheated on her in her 20s, there was a single, chilling note. Bankrupted. Exiled. 2021. Julian hadn't just been watching her. He had been her shadow executioner. He had been clearing her path by destroying anyone who dared to touch her, all while she thought he was her greatest enemy. It's a bit much, isn't it? The voice was closer than she expected. Sloane whirled around, the ledger slamming shut with a sound like a gunshot. Julian was leaning against the heavy steel door, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't look angry that she had broken in. He looked relieved, like a man who had finally been caught in a lie he was tired of telling. "You're insane," Sloane whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't love, Julian. This is a haunting. You've been living in my life like a ghost." Julian walked toward her, his eyes dark with an intensity that made the room feel small. He didn't stop until he was inches away, his shadow looming over the evidence of his decade-long obsession. "A ghost only watches, Sloane," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "I acted. Every time someone made you cry, I broke them. Every time you lacked, I provided, even if I had to burn your world down so you'd only have my hand to hold." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the side of her face. "You asked at dinner if I imagined you hating me. I did. I welcomed it. Because as long as you hate me, you're looking at me. And I'd rather be the villain in your story than a stranger in your crowd." Sloane looked around the room, at the years of stolen moments and calculated destruction. "Why me, Julian? Why did you fall this hard for someone who didn't even know you existed?" Julian leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "Because you were the only thing in this world I couldn't buy with just money. I had to earn your ruin. And now, I'm going to earn your heart. No matter how much blood it takes." The turning point. The mask is completely off. Sloane now knows. Julian isn't just a rival, he's a man who has centered his entire existence around her. The realization didn't break Sloane. It forged her. Standing in the center of that twisted shrine, she watched the flicker of vulnerability in Julian's eyes, the raw, bleeding need for her to acknowledge his devotion. She realized then that Julian Vane didn't just love her. He worshipped her. And a god is only as powerful as the person who knows their secrets. Sloane took a slow, deliberate step toward him, her bare feet pressing into the plush carpet of his secret sanctuary. She didn't flinch as he reached for her. Instead, she took his hand and placed it over her heart, her eyes locking onto his with a cold, terrifying clarity. "You spent 12 years building this cage." "Julian," she whispered, her voice no longer trembling. "It was as sharp as a diamond glass cutter. You destroyed lives to bring me here. You wanted me to see you. Fine, I see you." She leaned in, her lips grazing his jawline. "But if I'm the queen of this morbid little museum, then I want the keys to the rest of the kingdom. You said you'd do anything for me. Prove it." The play, corporate sabotage. The following morning, the atmosphere at the Obsidian had shifted. The prey had stopped running. Julian was in the glass-walled boardroom of Vane Holdings, surrounded by his terrified executives. They were discussing the hostile takeover of a tech conglomerate, a move that would put thousands of people out of work. The heavy doors swung open. Sloane walked in, dressed in a power suit of charcoal gray that Julian had bought her, her hair slicked back, looking every bit the butcher's bride. She didn't sit in the back. She walked straight to the head of the table, pulling a chair right next to Julian. The room went silent. Julian's advisors looked at him, waiting for him to eject her. Instead, Julian leaned back, a dark, fascinated smile playing on his lips. He was enthralled by her boldness. "Sloane," he purred, "we're in the middle of a slaughter. Do you want to watch?" "I want to lead," she said, sliding a folder across the table toward him. It contained a list of philanthropic foundations and employee-owned structures. "You're going to pivot the acquisition. You aren't going to liquidate them, Julian. You're going to rebuild them. Under my name." A murmur of protest rose from the board members. Julian's CFO stood up. "Mr. Vane, this is a multi-billion-dollar loss. We can't let a—" Julian didn't even look at the man. He kept his eyes on Sloane. "And why would I do that, darling? I like blood." "This plan is bloodless." Sloane leaned over, her hand disappearing under the table to rest on Julian's knee. She leaned into his ear, her voice a low frequency meant only for him. "Because if you do this, I'll let you stay in my room tonight. No locks. No arguments, just us. And if you don't, I'll burn every photo in that vault and make sure you never see me again. Even if I have to claw my way out of this building." Julian's breath hitched. The butcher was gone. In his place was a man who would set his own bank account on fire just to hear her say his name with a hint of warmth. He turned to the board, his face turning into a mask of cold iron. "The lady has spoken. Pivot the acquisition. If we lose $1 billion, we lose $1 billion. I'll make it back by Friday. Get out, all of you." The teasing becomes lethal. As the room cleared, Julian grabbed Sloane's wrist, pulling her onto his lap. The power dynamic was a tangled mess of silk and steel. "You're using me," he growled, his hand tightening on her waist. "You're using my obsession to play hero for the masses." Sloane laughed, a dark, melodic sound. She toyed with the knot of his tie, tightening it just enough to make his breathing heavy. "I'm not playing hero, Julian. I'm playing owner. You spent years manipulating my world. It's only fair I start rearranging yours." She nipped at his lower lip, a sharp, teasing bite that drew a tiny bead of blood. "You fell first, Julian, and you fell the hardest. That means you're the one who has to follow the rules." "And what is the first rule?" he asked, his voice shaking with restrained passion. Sloane stood up, smoothing her skirt, leaving him wanting and breathless in his own seat of power. "The first rule is never mistake my presence for my surrender. I'm here to take everything you have, and I think you're going to love watching me do it." Sloane is now the shadow CEO, and Julian is her willing weapon. But power like this attracts enemies. The shift was subtle at first. Sloane had spent the last 3 weeks treating the obsidian like her personal chessboard. She had spent Julian's money, redirected his assets, and most dangerously, she had begun to treat his obsession as a predictable weakness. She walked through his life with the casual arrogance of a woman who knew she was a goddess to the man who owned the city. But Julian Vane didn't become a billionaire by being a submissive. He was a predator who had simply learned to enjoy the scent of his own blood for a while. The breaking point came on a Tuesday at 3 a.m. Sloane was awakened not by a sound, but by the absence of one. The hum of the climate control had been cut. The smart glass windows of her bedroom, usually transparent to show the city lights, had been switched to a deep, impenetrable, opaque black. She reached for the lamp. It didn't turn on. "The power is out, Sloane." Julian's voice drifted from the darkness. He wasn't in a chair this time. He was at the foot of her bed, a silhouette darker than the room itself. "Julian, what are you doing?" Sloane sat up, pulling the silk sheets to her chest. She tried to maintain her sharp, teasing tone. "If you wanted to see me, you could have just knocked. Or is the butcher feeling dramatic tonight?" "The butcher is feeling hungry," he said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating through the mattress. "I've watched you for weeks, Sloane. I've let you play with my companies. I've let you hold the leash. I've even let you believe that I am a man who can be managed." He crawled onto the bed, a slow, predatory movement that forced Sloane to scramble back against the headboard. He didn't stop until his knees were on either side of her hips. He smelled of cold rain and a new, sharp metallic edge. "You've forgotten something important," he whispered, his hands coming up to pin her wrist to the velvet headboard. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. I didn't fall for you because I wanted a master. I fell for you because I wanted a partner who was as ruthless as I am. But lately, you've started to treat me like a pet. He leaned down, his nose brushing hers. In the dim light, his eyes were predatory. Do I look like a pet to you, Sloane? You're hurting me, she lied, testing him, her heart thundering. No, I'm not, he countered instantly, his voice a low growl. I know exactly how much pressure it takes to bruise you, and I haven't reached it yet. Don't lie to me. You love the weight of me. You love knowing that at any second, I could take back everything I've given you. He released her wrists only to slide his hand around the back of her neck, his thumb pressing firmly against the pulse, point that was betrayed by her frantic heart. Tomorrow, Julian said. The board meeting you scheduled to finalize the charity merger. It's canceled. The foundation's frozen. The Shadow CEO is taking a sabbatical. Sloane's eyes flashed with fury. You can't do that. We had a deal. The deal was that I would give you the world if you gave me you, Julian hissed, his face inches from hers. But you've been giving me a performance. You've been using my love as a shield to keep me at a distance. You thought that if you kept me busy with business, I'd stop wanting to consume you. He leaned in, his lips grazing the shell of her ear. The leash is off, Sloane. I'm going to remind you why you were afraid of me before you started trying to love me. I'm going to remind you that I didn't spend 12 years wanting to be your assistant. I spent 12 years wanting to be your end. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. Now tell me, are you going to keep playing the corporate queen, or are you going to acknowledge that the only reason you have a throne is because I'm kneeling at the foot of it, and I'm getting tired of the view? Sloane felt a shiver that wasn't fear. It was a dark, electric recognition. He had stripped away her cleverness and her schemes, leaving her with the raw, jagged truth of his obsession. What do you want, Julian? She whispered, her voice finally breaking. Everything, he said, his mouth descending toward hers. I want the parts of you that you don't even show yourself, and I'm going to take them, whether you're ready or not. The climax of the dark romance. Julian has asserted his dominance, proving that his love isn't a weakness, it's a weapon. The 48-hour lockdown transformed the obsidian from a palace into a vacuum. Julian didn't use locks. He used his presence. He stayed in the penthouse, abandoning his global empire, turning his back on billions, just to focus the entirety of his terrifying attention on Sloane. For the first 12 hours, Sloane fought. She threw his expensive scotch. She screamed at him for being a jailer. She tried to bribe the guards. Julian simply watched her from his chair, a glass of water in his hand, his expression unreadable. You're wasting energy, Sloane, he said quietly at the 18-hour mark. You're trying to spark a fire in a room that's already burning. The breaking of the mask. By the 24th hour, the silence became the weapon. No phones, no internet, no staff, just the two of them in a glass cage above the clouds. Sloane sat on the floor of the library, exhausted. Julian sat opposite her, the physical distance between them feeling like a live wire. Why did you really destroy my father? She whispered, her voice raw. You said you did it to bring me to you. But you could have just asked me out at 22. You could have been a normal man. Julian leaned forward, the shadows carving deep lines into his face. Because your father was going to sell you, Sloane. She froze. What? He didn't lose the company to me because of bad luck, Julian said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He was gambling with money he didn't have, and his collateral for his next debt was an arrangement for you to marry a man in Macau who would have made my obsession look like a fairy tale. I didn't just take his company. I bought his debt to keep you off that auction block. I ruined him to save you from a version of me that didn't have a soul. The silence that followed was deafening. The butcher hadn't just been hunting her. He had been a wall between her and a much darker world. The total surrender. By the 36th hour, the teasing was gone. There was only a devastating honesty. Sloane walked over to Julian. She didn't use her sexuality as a weapon this time. She sat on the floor between his knees, leaning her head against his chair. I hated you because it was easier than admitting I felt safe with you, she confessed, her eyes fixed on the city below. I used your money and your power because I thought if I made you a tool, I wouldn't have to acknowledge that you're the only person who actually sees me. Julian's hand moved to her hair, his fingers trembling, the first sign of weakness she had ever seen from him. I don't want to be your tool, Sloane. I don't even want to be your owner. Then what do you want? He pulled her up, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were bright with a desperate, ancient love. I want to be the only thing you can't live without. I want to be the heir. I want you to look at me and realize that the cage was never the penthouse. It was the fact that we belonged to each other. And there is nowhere else in this world for people like us. The final hour, the blood pact. At the 48th hour, the lights of the penthouse flickered back to life. The world was waiting for them. But they were different. Sloane stood at the window, the pomegranate locket still around her neck. Julian stood behind her, his arms wrapped tightly around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Are we going back to the office?" she asked. "The office is yours," Julian whispered. "Everything is yours. But the price has changed." "And what is the price?" Julian turned her around, his gaze burning into hers. "No more games. No more teasing to hide the truth. If I bleed, you bleed. If I fall, you're the one who pushed me. We are the architects of each other's ruin." Sloane reached up, tracing the line of his jaw before pulling him down into a kiss that tasted like surrender and victory all at once. "I think," she breathed against his lips, "that I've been ruined for a long time, Julian. I was just waiting for you to catch up. They weren't a billionaire and his prize anymore. They were two predators who had realized that the only thing more dangerous than being alone was being loved by someone just as dark as they were. The air in the private hangar was thick with the smell of jet fuel and the incoming storm. Across the tarmac, a Gulf Stream sat idling, the escape pod for Silas Varma, the man who had once viewed Sloane Ashford as a line item on a balance sheet. He was older, his face etched with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no, until Julian Vane systematically dismantled his shipping lanes. Varma stood near the stairs of his plane, flanked by two guards, when the black SUVs roared onto the concrete, cutting off his path. Julian stepped out first. He didn't look like a businessman. He looked like a reaper. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the door, offering a hand to Sloane. Sloane stepped out, wearing a coat the color of a bruise and heels that clicked like a countdown against the asphalt. She didn't look like the girl Varma remembered. The softness was gone, replaced by a cold, sharpened edge that matched the man standing beside her. "Silas," Sloane said, her voice carrying over the wind. "Leaving so soon? I thought we had a debt to discuss." Varma's eyes darted to Julian, then back to Sloane. He tried to summon a sneer. "Sloane, I see you've traded one cage for another. Does Vane know he's sleeping with a girl whose father sold her for a seat at my table?" Julian's expression didn't change, but the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. He took a step forward, his hand resting casually on Sloane's lower back, a gesture of absolute possession. "He knows," Julian said, his voice a low, terrifying hum. "He also knows that you touched the contract. With the hand you're currently using to hold that briefcase, that was your first mistake. This is business, Vane," Varma spat, though he stepped back toward his plane. "Her father owed me. The girl was the interest." Sloane walked forward, stopping just feet from Varma. She looked at him with a clinical sort of curiosity, the way a scientist looks at a specimen. "You didn't want a wife, Silas," she said softly. "You wanted a trophy to humiliate my father with. You wanted to break me to prove you were stronger." Then the Ashford name, she reached out and plucked the briefcase from his hand. He was too stunned by her boldness to stop her. "But you see, Julian doesn't want to break me. He wants to arm me." She handed the briefcase to Julian without looking. "You're not going to Macau, Silas," Julian said, his eyes locking onto Varma's with a lethal promise. "You're going to a federal holding cell. I spent the last 48 hours buying every judge and prosecutor on your payroll. By the time your plane is cleared for takeoff, your assets will be seized and your guards will realize I've offered them triple their salary to leave you here." As if on cue, the two guards stepped away, melting into the shadows of the hangar. Varma turned pale, his mouth working but no sound coming out. "Julian," Sloane whispered, loud enough for Varma to hear. "You promised me I could be the one to finish it." Julian leaned down, his lips brushing her temple, his gaze never leaving his rival. "The floor is yours, my love. Carve him up." Sloane stepped into Varma's personal space. She reached up and adjusted his silk tie, the same way she used to do for Julian. But there was no affection in it, only the cold precision of a predator. "My father is a weak man, Silas, but Julian is a monster. And the thing about monsters is that they protect what belongs to them." She tightened, the tie just a fraction too much, her eyes flashing with a dark, triumphant fire. "You thought I was interest on a debt? I'm the debt you can't afford to pay. Welcome to the end of your world." She turned on her heel and walked back to the SUV. Julian stayed for a moment longer, leaning in to whisper one last thing to the trembling man. "If I ever hear her name in your mouth again," Julian growled, "I won't use the law. I'll use my hands, and I promise you, I'm much better at one than the other." Julian climbed into the car beside Sloane. As they drove away, leaving Varma alone on the dark tarmac, he took her hand in his, interlacing their fingers. "Feel better?" he asked, his voice returning to that dark, teasing velvet. Sloane leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the hangar disappear in the rearview mirror. "I think I'm starting to enjoy being a Vane." Julian smirked, kissing her knuckles. "Good. Because we have 3 more acquisitions before dinner, and I'm expecting you to lead the negotiations." The SUV sped away from the hangar, but the silence inside the vehicle wasn't celebratory. It was jagged. Sloane stared out at the passing streetlights, the adrenaline of confronting Varma beginning to curdle into something else. She looked at her hand, still interlaced with Julian's. His grip was firm, too firm. It wasn't the hold of a lover. It was the grip of a man making sure his prize didn't bolt. "You knew," Sloane said, her voice barely a whisper. Julian didn't look at her. "I knew many things, Sloane. Which particular truth are you mourning now?" "You didn't just buy my father's debt to save me," she said, turning to face him, her eyes searching his cold, handsome profile. "You let him gamble. You fed his addiction through shell companies. You pushed him to the point where he felt he had no choice but to sell me to Varma, just so you could swoop in and be the hero. You created the monster so I would run into your arms." Julian finally turned. The mask of the protective partner shattered, revealing the terrifyingly hollow obsession beneath. A slow, dark smile spread. Across his face, the look of a man who was tired of pretending to be good. "I told you, Sloane," he purred, leaning in until their noses touched. "I earned your ruin. Did you think I'd leave something as important as your heart to chance? Your father was a weak link. I simply snapped it so I could replace it with a chain of my own making." The true dark turning. Sloane pulled her hand away as if his skin had turned to ice. "You're not just a monster, Julian. You're a ghostwriter. You've written every tragedy in my life for the last decade. And look how beautiful it made you," he countered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, possessive growl. "Look at the woman you are now. You're sharp. You're lethal. You're mine. If I had approached you as a normal man, you would have been bored within a month. You needed a war to realize you were a soldier." He tapped the glass partition, and the SUV slowed, pulling over in a desolate stretch of the industrial district, far from the polished lights of the Obsidian. "Where are we going?" Sloane asked, her hand drifting to the door handle. "The doors are locked, Sloane." "Don't be tedious." Julian reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, old photograph. It was frayed at the edges. It was Sloane at 18, laughing in a park. "This girl is dead. I killed her, and I don't regret it for a second." He leaned over her, his shadow swallowing her against the leather seat. "You thought the lockdown was over? That was just the orientation. You want to lead my empire? You want to be the butcher's bride? Then you have to accept that I am the author of your past and the architect of your future. There is no version of your life where I am not the one holding the pen. The final game." Sloane felt the cold weight of the pomegranate locket against her chest. She realized then that the countermove she thought she'd made was just another chapter he had allowed her to write. "What if I break the pen, Julian?" she challenged, her voice trembling with a mix of hate and a dark, sick attraction she couldn't excise. Julian's hand moved to her throat, not to squeeze, but to feel the frantic rhythm of her pulse. He looked at her with a hunger that was truly bottomless. "Then we'll see if you can survive the fall," he whispered. "Because I'm not letting go. Even if we hit the ground and shatter into a million pieces, those pieces will still belong to me." He signaled the driver. The car didn't head back to the penthouse. It headed toward the docks, toward a yacht that would take them into international waters where Julian's law was the only law that existed. "The world thinks Silas Varma was the villain," Julian said, pulling her into his chest as she began to fight him. "Let them believe it. It makes it so much easier for us to disappear." As the city lights faded behind them, Sloane realized the horrifying truth of a dark romance. The hero doesn't save you from the dark. He is the dark. And she was finally, fully submerged in him. The yacht, the siren's debt, was a silent monolith of carbon fiber and glass, cutting through the black swells of the Atlantic. There were no lights on deck, only the pale glow of the moon reflecting off the water. Inside the master suite, the walls were lined with silk, muffling the roar of the ocean to a rhythmic heartbeat thrum. Julian was at the bar, his back to Sloane. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, looking more like a pirate than a CEO. "Drink?" he asked, not turning around. "I'm not drinking anything you've poured, Julian," Sloane snapped. She was pacing the room like a caged panther. "You've taken me into international waters. You've admitted to ruining my father. What is this? The part where you keep me in a floating box until I develop Stockholm Syndrome?" Julian turned, his eyes dark and heavy. "You've had that for years, Sloane. You just called it ambition." He walked toward a safe embedded in the mahogany wall. He didn't use a code. He used his thumbprint. From the depths of the safe, he pulled out a thick, weathered envelope. He tossed it onto the bed. "You think the butcher is the one who destroyed your family," Julian said, his voice devoid of its usual teasing edge. "You think I'm the architect of your misery. Open it." The final secret. Sloane's hands shook as she tore the seal. Inside were medical records, bank statements from 20 years ago, and a series of letters written in a cramped, shaky hand she recognized instantly. Her mother's hand. As she read, the floor seemed to tilt more violently than the waves could account for. "My mother, she didn't die of a heart attack," Sloane whispered, her face ashen. "No," Julian said, stepping into her space, his voice a low, mournful growl. "Your father was a gambler even then. He owed money to people who don't use lawyers. Your mother found out he had put a lien on your future before. You were even out of primary school. She tried to leave him. She tried to take you." Sloane looked up, tears blurring her vision. "And? Your father stopped her. He didn't mean to kill her, I suppose. He just wanted to convince her to stay. But he was drunk. And he was desperate." Julian took the papers from her limp fingers. "I didn't destroy your father to get to you, Sloane. I destroyed him because I was the boy hiding in the rose bushes that night. I was the neighbor's son who saw him push her down those stairs. I spent 20 years building an empire just to ensure he died in the dirt for what he did to the only woman who ever loved you. The breaking point." Sloane collapsed onto the edge of the bed, the world spinning. The man she hated, the man who had ruined her, had spent his entire life being the silent witness to her mother's murder. He hadn't just been obsessed with her. He had been her self-appointed guardian, a dark angel fueled by a traumatic bond she hadn't even known they shared. "Why didn't you go to the police?" she choked out. "With what proof? I was a child. He was a wealthy man with friends in the precinct." Julian knelt before her, forcing her to look at him. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were burning with a terrifying sacrificial light. "I realized then that justice doesn't come from the law. It comes from power. I fell in love with you that night, Sloane. Not because of your beauty, but because we were both victims of the same man. I decided then that I would own the world, so I could give it back to you." He grabbed her hand, pressing it against his chest. "Teasing you, hurting your business, bringing you here. It was the only way to get you away from him, without you ever knowing the truth of what he was. I wanted to be the villain so you wouldn't have to know your father was the devil." The dark choice. Sloane looked at Julian, the man who had manipulated her life, the man who had loved her first and harder than anyone else ever could. The teasing hadn't been a game. It was a distraction. She reached up, her fingers trembling as she touched the scar on his jaw, a scar he'd gotten the night her mother died, trying to intervene. "You're a monster," she whispered. "I am," he agreed, his breath hitching as he leaned into her touch. "But I'm your monster, and now you know the truth. You can kill me, Sloane. You can take this yacht, my bank accounts, and my life. Or you can sit on the throne I built for you." Sloane felt the darkness of his world finally closing in, but for the first time it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like home. She pulled his head down, her kiss desperate, jagged, and full of a terrible, newfound understanding. "I don't want the throne alone, Julian," she breathed against his lips. "I want to watch the rest of the world burn with you." The yacht continued its path into the deep Atlantic, two broken souls finally merging in the dark, bound by blood, secrets, and a love that had started in the shadows of a tragedy. The secrets are out. The dynamic has shifted from captive to two people united by a dark past. The private island was a jagged shard of obsidian rising from the Caribbean, owned by no nation and governed only by Julian's whim. At its highest point sat a chapel built of bone-white marble and reinforced glass, overlooking a cliff where the waves crashed with a violent, rhythmic fury. There were no guests. There were no flowers. The only light came from 1,000 black candles that flickered in the salt-heavy wind. Julian stood at the altar, but he wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He wore a heavy dark coat, his eyes fixed on the entrance. He looked like a king waiting for his executioner or his equal. Sloane appeared in the doorway. She had discarded the silk dresses Julian had bought for her. She wore a gown of crimson lace that looked like wet blood under the candlelight, trailing behind her like a wound. In her hand, she didn't carry a bouquet. She carried the leather-bound ledger from Julian's vault, the record of everyone who had ever hurt them. The vows of the damned. She walked down the aisle, her eyes locked on his. The teasing was gone. The games were over. This was the final surrender. As she reached him, Julian took both of her hands. His grip was steady, but his eyes were wet with the intensity of a man who had waited 12 years for this breath. In the world below, Julian began, his voice echoing against the marble. They talk of love as a light. They talk of it as a healing, but they are small people with small hearts. He pulled a small silver blade from the altar. It was the same one he had used to carve up his rivals. Our love was born in the dark, he continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly vow. It was built on the ruins of our families and the blood of our enemies. I don't offer you a life of peace, Sloane. I offer you a life of war. I offer you my empire, my sins, and every breath I have left to draw. Sloane took the blade from his hand. She didn't flinch. She looked at the man who had destroyed her life, just to give her a better one. The man who had loved her with a hunger that had nearly consumed them both. I spent years fighting you, Julian, she said, her voice clear and cold. I thought you were my predator. I didn't realize you were my mirror. You didn't just fall for me first. You fell into the abyss and waited for me to join you. She pressed the edge of the blade to the palm of her hand, a thin red line blooming instantly. I don't want your protection, she whispered, stepping closer until their heartbeats synced. I want your partnership. I want the world to tremble when they hear the name, Vane. I want them to know that the butcher didn't just find a bride, he found his match. The seal of blood. Julian took the blade and mirrored her action, cutting his own palm. They pressed their hands together, their blood mingling and staining the white marble of the altar. It was a pact that went deeper than legal documents or gold rings. It was a soul tie, forged in the heat of obsession. With this, Julian growled, pulling her into his chest, I give you the keys to every vault, the trigger to every weapon, and the heart of the man who would burn the sun for you. Sloane reached up, her bloody hand cupping his face, leaving a dark smear across his cheek like war paint. Then let's start the fire, Julian. They didn't kiss with tenderness. It was a collision of teeth and desperation, a final seal on a bond that was as beautiful as it was horrific. Outside, the storm finally broke, thunder shaking the very foundation of the chapel. The aftermath. The world remembers. The next morning, the world woke up to a digital ghost. Every major news outlet, every stock exchange ticker, and every billboard in Times Square went black for exactly 60 seconds. When the screens returned, they displayed a single image. The Ashford and Vane crests fused into one, shimmering in deep crimson. Beneath it, a single sentence appeared in every language. The debt is settled. The reign begins. Silas Varma was found dead in his cell that morning. A pomegranate seed placed on his tongue. Sloane's father vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind a signed confession of every crime he had ever committed. Julian and Sloane were gone, lost to the private islands and the deep waters, but their shadow remained over the world's economy like a permanent eclipse. They were the billionaire and his muse, the butcher and his queen. He had fallen first, and he had fallen harder. But in the end, they had both hit the bottom together, only to realize they liked the dark just fine. The end. Epitaph, the butcher and the muse. In the ledger of the world, their names were written in ink that never truly dried. They say Julian Vane was a man of logic, of cold numbers and sharp steel, until he met the one variable he couldn't solve. He didn't fall for Sloane Ashford like a man trips into a grave. He fell like a star collapsing, violent, bright, and determined to pull everything into his own dark gravity. He was the architect of her ruin, only to realize she was the foundation of his soul. And Sloane? They called her a victim, then a prize, then a queen. But she was always the storm. She didn't survive the butcher. she mastered him. She took the jagged pieces of the life he broke and used them to build a throne that sat high above the reach of the law or the light. They lived in the spaces between the headlines, in the quiet moments before a market crashed or an enemy vanished. They were a reminder that love isn't always a sanctuary. Sometimes it's a blood pact. Sometimes it's the realization that the only person who can truly see you is the one who was willing to destroy you to find you.